August 15, 1942 marked the beginning of what would become documented as one of the Pacific War's most significant weapons system failures. In the waters surrounding Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, American patrol torpedo boats began combat operations against the Imperial Japanese Navy, with expectations that would prove tragically misplaced. Commander Teokarita, commanding a destroyer in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Southeast Area Fleet, observed the first encounters with these American vessels through the lens of professional skepticism. Intelligence briefings had characterized PT boats as small wooden craft displacing approximately 50 tons, armed with torpedo tubes and automatic weapons. Japanese naval doctrine, forged through decades of preparation and early war victories, viewed such light vessels as marginal threats to properly handled warships. The American PT boats arriving in the Solomon Islands theater represented significant investment in a specific tactical concept. Manufactured by the Elco Naval Division and Higgins Industries at shipyards along the American East Coast, these vessels measured 77 feet in length, with wooden hulls constructed from laminated mahogany. Their 3 Packard Marine engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, could theoretically propel the boats to speeds exceeding 40 knots. Armament consisted of 4 21-inch torpedo tubes, twin 50-caliber machine guns, and later installations of 20mm and 40mm automatic cannons. If you appreciate detailed evidence-based World War II history that examines both successes and failures, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating where you're watching from. We have viewers from over 60 countries following this documentary series. The tactical doctrine governing PT boat employment derived from pre-war planning that envisioned these craft as high-speed raiders capable of attacking enemy capital ships in restricted waters where larger American vessels could not operate effectively. Naval theorists had studied Italian MS boat operations in World War I and British coastal forces tactics, concluding that small, fast torpedo boats could offset numerical disadvantages through aggressive night attacks. This doctrine assumed weapons that functioned reliably under combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery received assignment to coordinate PT boat operations from the advance base at Tulagi in Florida Island, approximately 20 miles north of Guadalcanal. Montgomery's pre-war experience included destroyer duty and staff assignments, providing him with conventional naval operations background, but limited exposure to the unique characteristics of light torpedo craft. His initial assessments, documented in operational reports maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, reflected optimism, tempered by awareness of the untested nature of PT boat tactics in large-scale combat. The strategic situation in the Solomon Islands during August 1942 created urgent demand for any available naval assets. American Marines had conducted amphibious landings on Guadalcanal on August 7th, seizing the partially completed Japanese airfield that would be renamed Henderson Field. Japanese forces responded with immediate determination to recapture the island, establishing what would become known as the Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer and cruiser runs delivering reinforcements and supplies under cover of darkness. This tactical environment appeared ideal for PT boat operations, according to pre-war doctrine. Japanese vessels transited narrow straits and confined waters on predictable schedules, traveling at high speed but concentrated in relatively small areas. PT boats could theoretically position themselves along these routes, attack from concealment, and withdraw before enemy forces could respond effectively. The reality would prove substantially different from the theoretical assessments. The initial combat engagement involving substantial PT boat forces occurred on August 20, 1942, when 8 patrol torpedo boats intercepted a Japanese naval formation near Vella Lavella Island. This action would establish patterns that would repeat with disturbing consistency throughout the following year. Intelligence had identified a Japanese convoy consisting of 3 transport vessels, escorted by 2 destroyers, transiting through waters designated for PT boat interdiction. The 8 American boats, operating in 2 divisions of 4 vessels each, maneuvered into attack positions during the hours approaching midnight. Weather conditions were favorable, with partial moonlight providing sufficient visibility for attack runs while maintaining some concealment for the approaching American craft. The PT boat commanders executed their attacks according to established doctrine, approaching at high speed to within approximately 800 yards of their targets. The boats launched their Mark 13 torpedoes in coordinated volleys designed to overwhelm defensive measures. 17 torpedoes entered the water, propelled toward their targets by compressed air systems and powered by internal combustion engines burning alcohol fuel. What followed would be documented in after-action reports that reflected confusion, frustration, and the beginning of institutional recognition that serious problems existed with the torpedo system. Multiple torpedoes were observed running true toward their targets, leaving phosphorescent wakes visible in the moonlight. Crews watched these weapons approach Japanese vessels, anticipating the explosions that should follow impact. Instead, several torpedoes passed directly beneath enemy ships without detonating. At least one torpedo struck a destroyer with an audible impact heard by American crews, then failed to explode and sank. 3 torpedoes detonated prematurely, exploding at distances that caused no damage to enemy vessels, while revealing the PT boats' positions. The Japanese destroyers responded with immediate and effective counterfire, forcing the American boats to withdraw under heavy illumination from searchlights and incoming 5-inch shells. 0 damage was inflicted on enemy vessels in this engagement. Commander Karita's records, examined by American intelligence officers after the war, indicated that Japanese naval headquarters received reports of this action with reactions ranging from puzzlement to amusement. That American patrol boats had fired 17 torpedoes without achieving a single damaging hit struck Japanese officers as remarkable. Standard naval weapon systems of the era, even under adverse conditions, achieved hit rates substantially higher than 0%. The Mark 13 aerial and PT boat torpedo represented American naval ordnance development during the interwar period, when budgetary constraints and institutional assumptions combined to produce weapon systems insufficiently tested under realistic combat conditions. Understanding the technical failures requires examining the torpedo's design and the institutional context of its development. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, served as the primary development facility for American torpedo systems. Engineers working within tight budgets during the 1930s created the Mark 13 as a lighter-weight torpedo suitable for aircraft delivery and used by small craft like PT boats. The weapon measured 13 feet 5 inches in length, weighed approximately 2,200 pounds, and carried a 600-pound TNT warhead. Its propulsion system could drive the torpedo at speeds up to 33 knots with a range of 6,300 yards. The Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, intended to detonate the warhead when passing through a ship's magnetic field, embodied sophisticated technology developed with inadequate testing. This device was designed to explode beneath an enemy vessel's keel, where the resulting pressure wave and gas bubble would break the ship's spine more effectively than a side impact. In theory, this represented a devastating weapon improvement. In practice, the magnetic exploder proved extraordinarily sensitive to variables, including Earth's magnetic field variations, which differed significantly between the Atlantic waters where limited testing occurred and Pacific operating areas. The Mark 13's depth control mechanism, which should have maintained the torpedo at preset running depths, suffered from design flaws that caused weapons to run substantially deeper than intended. This problem directly interacted with the magnetic exploder's functioning, causing premature detonations or complete failures depending on circumstances. Additionally, the contact exploder, intended as a backup detonation system, utilized a design so fragile that impacts with ship hulls often shattered the mechanism without triggering the warhead. These technical problems were not unknown to American naval authorities. Submarine commanders had been filing reports about torpedo failures since the war's opening days in December 1941. Captain James Fife, commanding submarine operations from Brisbane, Australia, compiled documentation of repeated torpedo malfunctions that his submarine skippers encountered. These reports received dismissive responses from the Bureau of Ordnance, which attributed failures to operator error, poor maintenance, or flawed attack execution. rather than acknowledging design problems. The institutional resistance to acknowledging torpedo defects stemmed from multiple factors documented in post-war investigations. The Bureau of Ordnance had invested substantial resources and reputation in torpedo development. Senior officers responsible for weapons procurement faced career consequences if weapons they had approved proved defective. The Navy's cultural emphasis on aggressive offensive operations created reluctance to admit that American forces lacked effective weapons for those operations. These institutional factors combined to delay necessary corrections for over a year, while combat personnel continued experiencing failures. Lieutenant Howard Shorty Bauer's experience on September 11, 1942, exemplified the deadly consequences of systematic torpedo failure combined with aggressive tactical doctrine. Commanding PT-137, Bowers stalked a Japanese cruiser through heavy seas for over an hour, demonstrating the seamanship and tactical skill that PT boat doctrine emphasized. Achieving firing position at 800 yards, considered point-blank range for torpedo attacks, Bowers ordered all 4 tubes fired in rapid succession. The first torpedo's warhead exploded prematurely, approximately 200 yards from the boat, creating a massive water column that nearly capsized PT-137. The second weapon's engine failed immediately upon launch, causing the torpedo to spiral downward into the depths. The third torpedo exhibited a behavior termed porpoising, repeatedly breaking the surface and diving in an erratic pattern before passing far beneath the target. Only the fourth torpedo ran true, striking the cruiser's hull with an impact audible to the American crew. That torpedo failed to detonate. The Japanese cruiser responded with searchlights and 5-inch gunfire, forcing PT-137 into a high-speed evasive withdrawal that consumed precious fuel and resulted in 2 crew members wounded by shell fragments. The Japanese vessel continued its mission, apparently unaware how close it had come to potential damage if American torpedoes had functioned as designed. The Tokyo Express operations presented both opportunity and frustration for PT boat forces during this period. Japanese doctrine employed destroyers and fast cruisers to deliver reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal during nighttime runs, withdrawing before American aircraft could attack at dawn. These vessels typically traveled at 30 to 35 knots through confined waters, theoretically ideal conditions for torpedo boat attacks. PT boat squadrons attempted repeated intercepts of these runs throughout September and October 1942. Commanders positioned their boats along known routes, sacrificing speed and maneuverability by idling engines to reduce wake visibility. When Japanese vessels appeared, PT boats would accelerate to attack speed, close to torpedo range, and fire. The pattern of failures became grimly predictable. Premature detonations, depth control failures, magnetic exploder malfunctions, and contact exploder failures combined to produce hit rates approaching 0. The naval battle of Guadalcanal on the night of November 13, 1942, saw 8 PT boats caught in a massive surface engagement between American and Japanese capital ships. Lieutenant Robert Reed, commanding PT-109, later described navigating through a battleship and cruiser engagement where ships fought at ranges measured in thousands of yards while PT boats maneuvered between them. Reed's boat fired all 4 torpedoes at targets illuminated by burning vessels and star shells. He never confirmed whether any hit, and post-war examination of Japanese records revealed no torpedo damage to major vessels during this action. By November 1942, PT boat squadrons operating from Tulagi had fired over 100 torpedoes in combat engagements. Confirmed significant damage to enemy vessels totaled fewer than 5 instances. The psychological impact on crews became increasingly evident in after-action reports and personal correspondence. Ensign John Sauls, assigned to PT-59, wrote letters home describing the sick feeling of approaching enemy vessels knowing the torpedoes likely wouldn't function. His boat had fired 16 torpedoes in combat with 0 confirmed hits. Admiral Ernest King, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, ordered comprehensive investigation of torpedo performance in October 1942 as accumulated failure reports from both submarine and PT boat forces became impossible to ignore. The investigation's findings, compiled through late 1942 and presented in December, revealed systematic failures at multiple levels of weapons development and procurement. Engineering teams examining Mark 13 torpedoes determined that the weapon had never undergone adequate testing under realistic combat conditions. Pre-war testing protocols had utilized limited numbers of live-fire exercises, with most evaluation based on instrumented test runs using non-explosive warheads. This approach failed to identify problems that only manifested under combat conditions, including high-speed water entry, impacts with actual ship hulls, and operation in varying magnetic environments. The magnetic exploders problems proved particularly severe. The Mark 6 device detected changes in magnetic field strength as the torpedo passed beneath a steel ship's hull. However, Earth's magnetic field varies substantially depending on geographic location, and the Pacific Theater's magnetic environment differed significantly from the Atlantic waters where limited testing had occurred. The device proved so sensitive that it often detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all depending on subtle variations in depth, angle of approach, and magnetic field conditions. The depth control mechanism's tendency to cause torpedoes to run deeper than set resulted from a combination of design flaws and inadequate testing. When torpedoes were dropped from aircraft or launched from small craft like PT boats, the violent water entry compressed the depth control diaphragm, causing the torpedo to run as much as 10 feet deeper than intended. This problem had been identified during pre-war testing, but not corrected before full-scale production. The contact exploder, designated the Mark 5, utilized a mechanical firing mechanism so delicate that impacts with ship hulls often crushed the device without triggering detonation. This design prioritized sensitivity, ensuring the exploder would function even with glancing impacts, but achieved this through mechanisms too fragile for reliable operation under combat conditions. The investigation documented that Bureau of Ordnance officials had received reports of these problems from submarine commanders beginning in December 1941, but had consistently attributed failures to operator error rather than design flaws. This institutional response delayed corrections for nearly a year, while combat forces continued experiencing systematic failures. The investigation recommended immediate field modifications, including deactivation of magnetic exploders, adjustments to depth settings, and reinforcement of contact exploder mechanisms. These modifications began implementation in December 1942 at PT boat tender facilities in Tulagi and submarine bases throughout the Pacific. However, the modifications could not address fundamental design limitations. The improvements raised success rates from catastrophic levels to merely poor, with torpedo performance remaining substantially inferior to pre-war expectations throughout most of 1943. The human cost of PT boat operations during the Guadalcanal campaign, conducted with systematically defective primary weapons, became increasingly apparent through casualty statistics compiled by squadron commanders. By early 1943, PT boat forces in the South Pacific had sustained over 40% casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, with minimal confirmed enemy ship sinkings to justify these losses. PT-112 was destroyed by Japanese destroyer gunfire on January 11, 1943, after a torpedo attack failed. All 12 crew members were killed. The after-action report indicated the boat had fired 4 torpedoes at a destroyer from 600 yards range, achieving no hits. The destroyer counterattacked with 5-inch guns and automatic weapons, scoring multiple hits that detonated PT-112's gasoline tanks and ammunition storage. PT-44 struck a reef while withdrawing at high speed from a failed torpedo attack on January 23, 1943. The impact disabled the boat's engines, leaving it stranded in waters controlled by Japanese forces. The crew was captured during daylight hours and later executed, violating international conventions regarding treatment of prisoners of war. This incident highlighted how torpedo failures forced PT boats into extended exposures to enemy fire during repeated attack runs, increasing vulnerability to both direct combat and navigational hazards encountered during high-speed evasive maneuvers. PT-37 was sunk on February 1, 1943, when a Japanese destroyer caught the boat during daylight hours following a night engagement. The PT boat had attacked the destroyer the previous night, firing all torpedoes without achieving hits. The destroyer pursued at dawn, overtaking PT-37 and cutting it in half with gunfire. 6 crew members survived to become prisoners. 6 were killed in the action. Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, who had earned the Medal of Honor for evacuating General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines aboard PT-41, returned to the Pacific Theater in January 1943 to inspect PT boat operations. His report to Admiral William Halsey documented deteriorating morale, systematic weapons failures, and tactical employment that sent crews into missions they could not successfully accomplish. Bulkley's assessment concluded that continuing current employment patterns without addressing torpedo failures constituted negligence toward personnel under command. By February 1943, statistical analysis compiled by Commander Montgomery's staff documented that PT boats operating in the Solomon Islands had fired approximately 450 torpedoes in combat. Confirmed significant damage to enemy vessels totaled 7 instances. This yielded a hit rate of approximately 1.6%. For comparison, naval gunnery systems of the era achieved hit rates of 20 to 30% under similar conditions. The disparity indicated fundamental problems with either the weapons, the tactics, or both. Japanese records captured after the war provided enemy perspective on PT boat effectiveness during this period. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commanding Southeast Area Fleet operations, noted in diary entries that American torpedo boats had fired over 400 weapons with virtually no results by early 1943. His staff officers reportedly joked about American fireworks displays that preceded each PT boat withdrawal. This contempt for PT boat capabilities influenced Japanese tactical planning, leading to reduced defensive measures against these craft during Tokyo Express runs. The destruction of PT-109 on August 2, 1943, would achieve historical significance disproportionate to its tactical importance due to the subsequent political career of its commander, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. However, the incident exemplified fundamental problems with PT boat employment and effectiveness that transcended individual events. Kennedy commanded PT-109 as part of a patrol line established in Blackett Strait to intercept Japanese destroyer runs to Vila on Kolombangara Island. The tactical situation placed 15 PT boats along the expected Japanese route, with boats operating on reduced power to minimize wake visibility while maintaining station. This deployment pattern reflected standard doctrine for torpedo boat ambush operations. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, commanded by Commander Kohei Hanami, was conducting a Tokyo Express run at approximately 30 knots when lookouts spotted PT-109 at a range estimated at 200 yards. Kennedy's boat was idling on one engine when the destroyer appeared. According to American accounts, PT-109 attempted to accelerate and turn into attack position, but lacked sufficient time to maneuver before impact. The collision was catastrophic for the wooden-hulled patrol boat. Amagiri's bow struck PT-109 amidships, nearly severing the boat. The impact killed 2 crew members immediately, Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold Marney. Gasoline tanks ruptured, igniting a fire that engulfed the stern section. Kennedy and 10 surviving crew members found themselves in water, covered with burning fuel. The destroyer continued its mission without stopping, having sustained only minor damage to hull plating. Commander Hanami's after-action report, examined after the war, described the incident as unremarkable. His vessel had struck an American patrol boat that failed to detect the destroyer's approach despite favorable conditions. No evasive maneuvers had been necessary. No torpedoes were fired at Amagiri. The destroyer required minor repairs after completing its mission. Kennedy's subsequent actions, swimming 3 miles to Plum Pudding Island while towing badly burned crew member Patrick McMahon, then island hopping to establish contact with coast watchers who arranged rescue, demonstrated genuine heroism and leadership. However, from a tactical perspective, PT-109 had been destroyed without engaging the enemy offensively. The boat never fired its primary weapons, never attempted to fulfill its assigned mission of interdicting enemy vessels. This incident raised questions about PT boat effectiveness that public relations efforts worked to obscure. that an enemy destroyer could approach and strike a PT boat without the patrol boat detecting the threat or attempting combat raised concerns about either the boat's capabilities or crew performance. Japanese officers viewed the collision as further evidence of PT boat inadequacy. The boats were fast when fleeing, but apparently helpless when attempting to attack. The American public received carefully managed information emphasizing Kennedy's heroism while omitting tactical context. The Navy's propaganda value in having a decorated PT boat officer was substantial, particularly as the torpedo failure scandal became more widely known within military circles. Kennedy's genuine courage in rescuing his crew provided a positive narrative at a time when PT boat operations faced increasing scrutiny. Admiral William Halsey convened a conference at Noumea on September 15, 1943, to address PT boat effectiveness directly. The meeting assembled squadron commanders, ordnance experts, and operational analysts who had studied every documented torpedo attack since the campaign's beginning. The conference's objective was to determine whether PT boats could be employed effectively in their designed role or required fundamental mission changes. Commander Montgomery presented statistical analysis covering the period from August 1942 through September 1943. PT boats in the South Pacific had fired 743 torpedoes in combat. Confirmed hits causing significant damage totaled 18 instances, yielding a success rate of 2.4%. Of those 18 hits, only 6 resulted in enemy vessels actually sinking. The kill ratio, torpedoes fired to ships sunk, stood at 124 to 1. For comparison, American submarines operating with the same basic torpedo design achieved kill ratios of approximately 15 to 1 during the same period. Even accounting for submarines' advantages, including larger torpedo capacity and better fire control systems, the disparity indicated that PT boat operations suffered from problems beyond defective torpedoes. Either PT boat tactics were fundamentally flawed, or the boats faced structural limitations that prevented effective torpedo employment. Lieutenant Commander Reed, promoted after surviving a year of combat operations, argued that PT boat doctrine developed during peacetime exercises against cooperative targets had proven inadequate for actual combat. The boat's gasoline engines produced noise and wake that alert enemies could detect, compromising surprise. Wooden hulls provided minimal protection against automatic weapons fire. Small size limited torpedo capacity to 4 weapons, meaning crews lacked the ammunition for sustained attacks or correction of initial misses. Most significantly, Reed argued that effective torpedo attacks required approaching within 800 yards of targets, a range at which enemy destroyer armament could destroy PT boats with concentrated fire. The boats achieved surprise so rarely that most attacks degenerated into gun duels where PT boats were substantially outmatched. The tactical calculus required risking boats and crews for attacks that rarely succeeded, even when torpedoes functioned properly. The conference examined captured Japanese after-action reports that provided enemy assessment of PT boat capabilities. These documents described American patrol boats as nuisance weapons that disrupted operations through persistence but rarely inflicted serious damage. Vice Admiral Kusaka's staff had concluded that standard defensive procedures, searchlights, suppressive fire, and aggressive maneuvering almost invariably defeated PT boat attacks. Japanese commanders recommended treating PT boats primarily as reconnaissance threats rather than combat vessels requiring major tactical consideration. Ordnance representatives from the Naval Torpedo Station defended their improvements to the Mark 13, presenting test data showing increased reliability. However, submarine officers present challenged this assessment. If submarines could achieve reasonable success with the same basic torpedo design, the problem lay with either the PT boat variant or PT boat employment, rather than fundamental torpedo design. Admiral Halsey's decision, based on statistical evidence and tactical assessment, fundamentally changed PT boat mission in the South Pacific. Torpedo attacks would no longer be the primary operational focus. Instead, PT boats would concentrate on anti-barge operations, coast watching, fire support for amphibious operations, and reconnaissance missions. These roles emphasized the boat's speed and automatic weapons rather than their torpedoes. This decision represented acknowledgement that continuing to employ PT boats in missions optimized for unreliable weapons constituted criminal negligence toward personnel under command. The boats possessed value if employed in roles matching their actual capabilities rather than theoretical doctrine. The transition to anti-barge operations during 1944 allowed PT boats to demonstrate effectiveness in roles matching their capabilities. Japanese supply lines in the New Guinea and Solomon Islands campaigns increasingly relied on powered barges, essentially armored landing craft capable of navigating shallow coastal waters inaccessible to larger vessels. These barges, typically displacing 50 to 100 tons and traveling at 6 to 8 knots, moved supplies and troops during night hours while hugging coastlines. They represented critical logistics links for Japanese garrisons isolated by American air and sea superiority. Unlike destroyers and cruisers, barges could not outrun PT boats or bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Lieutenant John Duke Coley commanded PT-191 during a mission on February 3, 1944, that exemplified the new PT boat doctrine. Intelligence identified a convoy of 7 Japanese barges moving along the New Britain coast. Coley led a division of 4 PT boats in a coordinated attack using automatic weapons rather than torpedoes. The PT boats attacked in a sweep formation, 50 caliber machine guns and 20 mm cannons, creating overlapping fields of fire. Unlike torpedo attacks requiring precise positioning and weapon launches, gun attacks were immediate and adjustable. Tracers allowed gunners to observe impacts and correct aim. Explosive rounds detonated ammunition and fuel carried by the barges. Within 15 minutes, all 7 barges were either sinking or burning. The PT boats suffered minor damage from return fire, but no casualties. Coley's after-action report reflected the transformation in crew morale. Finally, PT boats had engaged in missions where they could observe direct immediate results rather than watching torpedoes malfunction. By mid-1944, PT boats were destroying more Japanese vessels monthly than they had during the entire previous year of torpedo operations. The boats achieved this with substantially fewer casualties. New PT boat designs eliminated 1 or more torpedo tubes to accommodate additional automatic weapons, formally acknowledging the shift from torpedo boats to fast attack gunboats. The psychological impact on crews was transformative. Personnel who had endured months of failed torpedo attacks now engaged in missions where their weapons functioned reliably and produced observable results. Morale recovered as crews recognized they were contributing effectively to the campaign rather than executing futile attacks with defective weapons. Japanese response to this tactical evolution was grudging respect. Commander Tamechi Hara, whose destroyer Shigure had contemptuously brushed off PT boat torpedo attacks, noted in post-war writings that PT boat gun attacks on supply barges had become genuinely problematic. The barges could not outrun the boats, could not effectively return fire against their superior armament, and were vulnerable to the very characteristics that made PT boats poor torpedo boats, their speed and maneuverability. The final accounting of PT boat torpedo effectiveness, compiled after the war, made for devastating reading. Through the entire Pacific War across all theaters, PT boats fired approximately 1/200 torpedoes in combat. Confirmed kills attributed to PT boat torpedoes numbered fewer than 30 vessels total, with many attributions questionable based on inconclusive evidence from night actions where multiple Allied forces engaged the same targets. The South Pacific Campaign, where over 700 torpedoes had been fired between August 1942 and September 1943, accounted for the majority of failures and the smallest proportion of successes. This represented one of the war's most significant weapon system failures, comparable to early German torpedo problems and various other military procurement disasters. The institutional response to this failure shaped post-war American military procurement processes. The Bureau of Ordnance underwent complete reorganization after investigations revealed how bureaucratic arrogance and refusal to acknowledge field reports had perpetuated the Mark 13 fiasco for over a year. Admiral King personally relieved several senior ordnance officers whose careers had been built on the torpedo program. The reorganization implemented rigorous testing protocols, requiring weapons to undergo realistic combat condition evaluation before full-scale deployment. Perhaps more importantly, new procedures created feedback channels, allowing operational commanders to report weapon failures without fear of being blamed for the failures they reported. This addressed the cultural problem that had caused frontline reports to be dismissed as operator error rather than investigated as potential design flaws. Commander Montgomery, promoted to captain and assigned to Washington to help implement procurement reforms, wrote a classified report that became required reading at the Naval War College. His analysis dissected how the torpedo failure occurred through cascading institutional failures: insufficient testing, dismissal of negative reports, assumption that peacetime doctrine would translate to combat conditions, and unwillingness to admit mistakes until casualties became undeniable. The financial cost of the torpedo failure was staggering even by wartime standards. Each Mark 13 torpedo cost approximately $10,000 in 1943 dollars, roughly equivalent to $160,000 in 2024 currency. The 800 torpedoes fired in the South Pacific represented $8 million in direct weapon costs, plus operational costs of the missions that fired them, plus replacement costs for PT boats lost in failed attacks. For a weapon system that sank perhaps a dozen enemy vessels total, the cost-benefit analysis was catastrophic. The human cost was measured in at least 200 American sailors who died in PT boat operations during the period when torpedo attacks remained the primary mission. While not all these deaths resulted directly from torpedo failures, the defective weapons undeniably extended PT boats' vulnerability during attacks, forcing longer exposures to enemy fire, while crews attempted to achieve hits with unreliable weapons. Japanese naval officers' perspective on American PT boat operations, preserved in post-war interrogations and captured documents, provided valuable assessment of how systematic weapon failure affected enemy tactical planning. Admiral Teao Kurita, commanding remnants of Japanese naval forces in the home islands by March 1945, composed a staff assessment of American naval capabilities that was captured after Japan's surrender. Kurita's assessment, translated and declassified in subsequent decades, reflected on PT boat operations throughout the Pacific War. He calculated that if American torpedoes had functioned properly during 1942 and 1943, Japanese losses in destroyers and transports during the Guadalcanal and New Guinea campaigns would have been substantially higher. The Tokyo Express runs that kept Japanese garrisons supplied had operated with minimal concern for PT boat attacks, specifically because those attacks had proven ineffective. Kurita noted that a single American torpedo boat, operating with reliable weapons in confined waters at night, could theoretically threaten even capital ships. Fast, maneuverable, difficult to target, and capable of withdrawing before effective counterattacks could be organized. The Admiral acknowledged that PT boats' transition to gunboat roles had been operationally sound, but represented fundamental admission of the torpedo program's failure. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, when questioned by American naval historians after the war, stated that Japanese commanders had been puzzled by American persistence in using weapons that obviously didn't work. He estimated that if PT boat torpedoes had functioned with even submarine-level reliability, Tokyo Express operations would have required substantial additional destroyer escorts, potentially altering the Guadalcanal campaign's timeline. Commander Tamechi Hara provided extensive post-war interviews, acknowledging that Japanese contempt for PT boats during 1942-1943 had been so complete that standard defensive procedures were often not followed. Japanese commanders simply didn't believe PT boats could seriously threaten their vessels, an assessment the torpedo failure rate repeatedly validated. When PT boats transitioned to gun-based attacks on supply vessels, Japanese tactical assessments required complete revision. The Japanese perspective treated the American torpedo failure as a cautionary tale about overconfidence in technology and institutional resistance to acknowledging problems. While Japan had its own weapon failures during the war, Japanese naval doctrine emphasized reliability and extensive testing. Professional naval officers, regardless of nationality, understood the betrayal combat personnel felt when their weapons failed them. The PT boat torpedo failure's legacy extended far beyond immediate tactical consequences, shaping how the United States Navy developed, tested, and deployed weapon systems in subsequent decades. The Mark 13 torpedo became a cautionary example studied by every generation of naval officers through institutional memory and formal education. The Bureau of Ordnance's institutional arrogance, which had dismissed frontline reports as user error rather than design failure, was systematically dismantled and replaced with structures prioritizing operational feedback. These reforms couldn't prevent all future weapon failures. Military history continued accumulating examples, but they created institutional pressure toward acknowledging and addressing problems rather than denying them. The 800 torpedoes fired by PT boats in the South Pacific became numerical shorthand for systemic failure in military circles. Another PT boat torpedo became sardonic military slang for any weapon system that looked impressive in specifications but failed under combat conditions. The phrase appeared in classified assessments of troubled weapons programs for decades, serving as ghostly reminder that technological sophistication means nothing if the technology doesn't work when needed. John F. Kennedy's presidency brought renewed attention to PT boat operations, though Kennedy himself rarely discussed PT 109's loss circumstances in detail. When he addressed his wartime service, he focused on rescuing his crew rather than the tactical situation that made rescue necessary. The broader context, that his boat had been destroyed without firing a shot as part of a campaign where hundreds of torpedoes accomplished almost nothing, remained diplomatically obscured. Kennedy understood that individual sailors' heroism and systemic weapon failure were separate truths that could coexist. The PT boat program's redemption through adaptation to gunboat roles provided lessons about military organizational flexibility. Organizations that can recognize failure, abandon failing doctrines, and rapidly adapt to circumstances historically outperform those that rigidly adhere to plans regardless of results. PT boats in their final configuration, fast gunboats rather than torpedo boats, proved genuinely valuable in the Pacific War's later stages, supporting amphibious operations and providing coastal patrol capabilities that larger vessels couldn't match. Commander Montgomery's post-war testimony before Congress about military procurement reform argued that the Mark 13 failure represented not just technical problems, but moral failure to support men ordered to use defective weapons. His testimony helped establish oversight mechanisms requiring independent testing of weapon systems before full-scale deployment. These reforms created greater accountability in weapons development while never eliminating the inherent challenges of predicting how systems will perform under actual combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Reed's definitive study of the PT boat torpedo failure, published in 1968, documented how the Bureau of Ordnance had ignored or suppressed negative reports from submarine and PT boat commanders throughout 1942. He revealed that successful torpedo designs used by British and German forces had been studied but not adopted due to not invented here attitudes among American designers. Most critically, Reed demonstrated that the Mark 13's fundamental flaws were known to engineers before the war. But production pressures and bureaucratic momentum prevented needed redesigns. The human stories behind the statistics emerged through interviews Reed conducted with surviving PT boat veterans. These men described weapon failure's corrosive effect on combat effectiveness and morale. They spoke about black humor that developed, jokes about baptizing torpedoes instead of firing them, since the weapons seemed to do nothing but get wet. They remembered rage and helplessness, watching torpedoes malfunction, while Japanese ships that should have been sinking steamed away untouched. The 700-plus torpedoes fired in the South Pacific campaign remained a cautionary tale echoing through subsequent decades, a reminder that impressive weapons matter far less than weapons that actually work when needed most. The Japanese admirals had laughed, and their laughter had been entirely justified. The tragedy was that it took so long and cost so much for American institutions to acknowledge the problem and implement solutions. The PT boats found their purpose. The torpedoes were eventually fixed. The war was won. But the 700 torpedoes fired in the South Pacific campaign served as permanent warning that enemy laughter at your failures is less dangerous than your own refusal to acknowledge them. In military history, as in institutional management generally, the capacity to recognize failure and adapt accordingly often determines survival and success more than initial tactical or technological advantages.